Well, from what I've seen from various photographs of the history of the place, in the 30s, 40s, it was very tribal here. You know, you had the Dubai tribe, the Abu Dhabi tribe, the Sharjah, the Al-Qasimi tribe, and they were all completely separate. It was called the Trucial states then, of course. And in the 30s, the Royal Air Force and British Army established a base in Sharjah and constructed a runway. And that was really the first development, if you like, in the area.
The development of infrastructure, I think, was such a critical way of entering into modernity. And that happened, I think, in Dubai earlier than in Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi, it happened later in the late 60s, actually.
And I think, in a way, the impact of planning is so important. Maybe in the case of Dubai in the late 1950s, 60s, with the Harris master plan, it's not so much planning created Dubai, but Harris put this series of roads onto a desert as one way of anticipating, following instructions of Sheikh Rashid at the time, as one way of anticipating a really rapid development. So it was not planning a very conventional way of creating streets so much and buildings and in between spaces as they're all part of Dubai, but really it's looking out into the landscape.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Harris, because John Harris, he worked, of course, on the two Dubai master plans, the one in 59, I think, and the other one, 71. And what he did in Dubai is that he tried to some extent to preserve Bastakeya, the old district, and he also presented a master plan to Sheikh Shakhbout in 62. Not the master plan, but was, I think, part of the Halcrow master plan, where he tried as well to preserve the old city of Abu Dhabi.
Yeah,
and it didn't happen.
I think he was the only one who did that. And I mean, there's a couple of people that have influenced Abu Dhabi, and the kind of pattern or blueprint that rose from essentially nothing to what it is today. I think he was probably one of the only ones who actually looked at the natural grid system and orientation of buildings and streets, etc., and tried to kind of respect that and build around it. But I think ultimately, as other influences came in and modernity and the grid was seen as progressive, and that naturally took on shape and form and is still very much influencing planning today.
But I think this idea of the infrastructure, the airport as a stopover, if you like, port for Southeast Asia from Europe, Port Rashid also, the creek, they're all huge infrastructural projects that had such an incredible impact on the planning of the cities. No, it's not about planning the little streets, but just planning this mega infrastructure.
But all of these towns are based on cores or inlets on the sea. So they all started because of protected water in some description. So you had a creek, and then the houses developed around the creek, and the small communities around the creek. And in Dubai, you had that at Shindaga, etc. But there were also other places like Zabil Palace, Jumeirah, and the planners had to link these together. And I think that was how they started the initial road network, to link these together. In the beginning, there was a series of small villages. There was Leia village, Al Khan village, Hera village, and these were all fishing, pearling communities. Yeah. And everything revolved around the creek, the souk, the people lived there. I mean, even when I came here in the early 70s, I think the population of Sharjah was 40,000. Now it's 1.5 million. In 65, Halcrow came to Sharjah, came to Dubai in the 50s, they came to Sharjah in the 60s. And in mid-60s, we were asked to prepare a basic master plan, which was sort of linking these villages that I was talking about before, and other landmarks in the Emirates, which His Highness was keen on establishing. And it was just a basic grid. At the beginning of the grid we see today, and that grid was then taken over by His Highness and the municipality, and slowly expanded. They've been doing it themselves, but based on this very basic grid.
A big part of what we're trying to do at the moment in the Planning Council is be able to actually reintroduce that walkability and that sense of closeness in space for people to be able to easily move and transport themselves between places. Community design is key. To be able to look at your land uses, be able to put people and populations and large numbers in close proximity to essentially their amenities and where they're going to be living. And so that very much takes on board the similar pattern that we would have had historically, where families and tribes, etc., would live within closer proximities to each other and the amenities that they would be using.
So in a way, modernity at the time was such an amazing way of creating the new cities and the emerging new nation in the 1970s, even though one had to work completely on an empty land. And as Yasser was just saying, maybe we can come back to this again, that every ruler has his own visions and his own design team in a way, and it's kind of fascinating. It's kind of modernity with a little individuality as well. But also it had some other effects. For example, in Dubai, the introduction of planning law, setbacks, new construction materials, widening of streets, in a way kill the courtyard house. It's interesting to see the growth of the UAE cities wouldn't be possible without planning. But at the same time, these cities grew even without planning. And there was a kind of interesting way of negotiating the master plan and the future vision with the reality. And these plans, I think all the master plans were never fully realized, but they were revised and so on because of changing economic conditions, the rulers coming against different problems that they had to solve, so they shifted attention and so on. I find that really interesting, that the plan was more like a reactionary condition, but still very flexible to accommodate unpredictable changes. And the history of the UAE city is full of rapid changes, whether
Yes.
economic, social, issues of heritage, issues of sustainability, issues of social participation, and so on. So in a way, the master plan, it's more like a vehicle rather than something engraved in stone.
Yes, and even in Dubai, for instance, it was never really called the master plan. For instance, the 1985 plan was called structural framework.
Yeah.
And even Abu Dhabi, the 2007, right, the initial, the idea was that rather than having a master plan that is fixed, you know, which is much more in line with reality.
Yeah.
And I think cities here sort of developed around major infrastructure projects. It's like the dredging of the creek, the building of Dubai Airport, for example. And many people are saying that Dubai is mostly a city built around the airport, which is right in the middle of the city. Then you had Rashid Port, Jebel Ali, and now you have Expo 2020, which is at the very edge, the west towards the border with Abu Dhabi. Major developments will take place around that. So in a way you can read the development of cities here in the region through these projects, these iconic, like the tower you were talking, Russia Tower or World Trade Center you were talking about before. Similarly in Abu Dhabi, for instance, the airport now that is being built, midfield terminal, Saadiyat, these cultural icons that are, so it's not necessarily like an overall vision, but it's more like these iconic pockets, and then stuff happens around them, you know.
But what is interesting is that these projects which go ahead, they go ahead because the ruler has thought about them. They don't carry out a feasibility study. Nothing like that is done. They build the project and it's going to work. You know, Dubai Dry Docks was built. It lay dormant for 5 years until they found an operator. Then it took off. Jebel Ali Port was built. Who wants 40 berths? You know, this is ridiculous. Now it's a roaring success.
I would very much say that the cities were engineered. that was the culture of where and how these cities grew. You know, these projects, these engineering and infrastructure projects drove a lot of that growth. I think now, though, the planning culture is really the thing that is coming to the forefront, and very much so from leadership themselves. We see this in 2006 when His Highness Sheikh Khalifa had a very strong policy agenda in place which looked at growth and development and linked that really strongly with the economic vision. It was straight away decided that a council of planners needed to be developed in order to manage the extreme rapid growth and development which was occurring, to shape how that took place, to provide that stitching between the communities and developments that were coming into play. And that's really where planning begins to come in, and the engineering is an enabler, a facilitator of that, but it isn't at necessarily the forefront.
Out in the desert, it was in a place called Al Wasl, somewhere near where Burj Khalifa is now.
Yes.
It was, at that time, way beyond the edge of development. And did a scheme there. And I came out, and so I particularly, one of my trips out, I took lots of photographs and did sketches of Arish construction, photographed traditional houses and so on, at that time from the outside. And it was only afterwards that I got the chance to go and measure a wind tower house. In fact, all I was asked to do was measure a wind tower. And when I went into the house, which was the Bakash house, it was so really beautiful that I asked the family if I could measure the whole house, if they would mind.
Yes.
And I did so every evening after work, until I was a young boy who was helping me measure the house and holding the tape and arranging which rooms I could go into at which times. Eventually he said to me, my father asked if you're finished yet, and I took the hint. And luckily I had taken so many photographs and I had enough survey information that I could spend the next sort of 9-10 months drawing it up in my little free time. Vernacular was under threat, and so I was aware that when I was doing that survey that I was recording something that may not be there for very long. And there was a slight irony to it, because John Harris, who employed me at the time, helped sponsor the publication. He thought that it was important to do so. And ironically, it was his project, the new Diwan for Sheikh Rashid, which he never used, which demolished half of the Bastikir, including the house I surveyed. So I was very glad that I had done that. But it was, there was a perception of it that it was, these old buildings were undesirable, that they weren't really fit for habitation. They couldn't be air conditioned, they were damp. And I don't think at the time people really valued them, the cultural qualities, which were very, very high, but they were secondary to the discomfort, the dampness, the smell of salt, and they were old-fashioned. There was a sense of moving forward, looking forward, and you've got to remember that life in the time when those houses were being lived in, where you had Arish houses alongside the coral and sea stone houses, life was very hard here. There was a really high mortality rate.
Yes.
A pregnant mother might well die giving birth, or the child may not survive, and there was very high mortality rates. Sickness there was very little, no sophisticated medicine here. So.
Yes, I think
I think all of that was associated together, not just the architecture. I think that there was a sense that there was a need to improve our qualities of life here. So to be able to move into an air-conditioned apartment where you didn't rely just on a wind tower, if you were lucky enough to have one, to be able to have a fridge, to have a cooker and rather than using
And
Well,
running
that
water.
was
and
yeah,
flushing,
it was,
flushing toilets.
Yes.
Yeah, but people also almost, it was an expectation that it was now their right. And maybe that's seen particularly from the Abu Dhabi end, that the population had just also experienced a change of ruler, and you know how Sheikh Zayed was greeted as the one who will bring all those changes that people had already heard about, that people in other parts of the Gulf where the oil industry had arrived earlier, and they knew what to expect. They knew how to expect hospitals and roads and schools and all of that, airports, but also they knew how to expect how to live. And therefore, it was almost,
They demanded
urge,
it.
a demand. And in Abu Dhabi, certainly the demand was very quickly
met
fulfilled,
very
was
quickly,
met
yes.
very quickly. And these low-cost houses were, rolled out in groups of houses for groups of traditional tribal communities, and people, expected that, and so it was also, one could see, even in 1968, we could see that by 1969, the souk in Abu Dhabi and one of the beautiful sort of old-style houses built of coral stone which was the customs house. We would see this will go, and the bulldozer, surely, by 1969, it had all gone.
The Arish houses, the traditional houses, for them, it's like something related to the old
Yes.
And being
past.
poor.
And being poor, yes.
Yeah.
So let us demolish it, let us forget it and move to another houses
Yeah.
or other modern. Yes.
For me, one of the interesting things is that where the plot of land was finite, the house was pushed towards the back. The front is courtyard for the car.
Yes.
And that certainly, first of all, tells me that people wanted to go from the outside, from living close to outside, to the sand, to, the inside is where life happens indoors.
This is what I call it shift in value,
Yes.
shift in social value. In the old days, we used to concentrate more in the inner space, okay? And there is like a clear separation between outside and inside.
Yeah.
There is no direct look from the outside to the inner side. Always there is barrier.
Barrier,
Okay.
yes.
We call it in traditionally radda, recess. Nobody from outside can directly look to the
Yes.
courtyard. As you said, by the time things become, instead of having the garden inside the house, the garden shifted to be outside the house.
We had a group of people came here in 1949 to find out what sort of materials were available for building. We needed to build camps where we were going to drill the first well. And there was cement was available, yes.
Imported
From Japan.
From Japan. Okay.
And it was said that the Japanese cement was cheaper than the English cement, and it was not so good. Well, never mind. And then, of course, there was the jus, which our people inspected. Jus factories, they described them as in Dubai and Sharjah. There wasn't one in Abu Dhabi. And they said the jus was very inferior quality and therefore not really much use. So that was cement and jus both condemned. But they did say that you could use the cement to make blocks, cement blocks, but you would have to use the beach sand, which therefore you were using saline, rather salty water.
Which attacks
because
the
the
salt.
sand of the desert was far too rounded and hopeless. At least the beach sand in many places was angular and therefore. And they said, as for the coral, well, it was too expensive. A cubic meter of coral was quoted as being 9 dirhams. Now, 9 rupees. 9 rupees in those days. But when you think that that was the daily wage for a skilled carpenter was 9, so that was a lot of money. Or a watchman, for example, would earn 2 rupees a day. This was 9 rupees for a cubic meter of not that much coral. So coral was also out as a building material. It was too expensive. So in the end, of course, what the company did was they made what we call breeze blocks, and they also brought in the Nissen huts from the military huts, which were used all over the place by the British military. And we did not use the Arish at all. It lacked strength, and anyway, the winds blew straight through it.
And a fire risk.
And the fire risk came also later, yes, but that also applied to the Basra board, of course.
But also there wouldn't have been enough date palms
No.
handy by the coast.
No, and
Not
in
enough
fact,
to use for
no, and in
construction.
fact, a lot of this sort of stuff was imported either from Basra, from Iraq, or from Baluchistan, and wood was imported from India, of course. There was very little here, really. And as for the standard of the labour to construct anything, build anything, well, they found that there were no contractors in Abu Dhabi, build contractors in Abu Dhabi available at that time. And in Dubai and Sharjah, they found a total of 5, but they were somewhat dubious about the whole arrangement.
That was in 49.
In 49, yes.
My very strong impression of Dubai, and which totally seduced me, and was the relationship between the souk and the water, and on the edge of the creek.
Yes.
It was really special.
was
The
magic.
water lapped against the houses. You know, it's sort of separate now. Just a little bit of it left. The Bastakir, the door was already reclaimed land in front of the Bastakir with warehouses. So the Bastakir didn't have that same relationship with the water. Shindaga did. Still, Shindaga was right close to the water. And, you know, the Maktoum Bridge was just 1 lane each way. So there was always traffic jams going up to the clock tower roundabout,
Yes.
which was a very nice thing. It was the landmark.
It was a landmark.
But this relationship was missing in Abu Dhabi. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
And that is why people don't even now know and remember that there were also wind tower houses in Abu Dhabi, but they weren't so spectacular. You couldn't look at them, across a creek or across the water. And there were fewer, but there were wind tower houses in the same fashion.
And that
not quite so
relationship
big.
between the boats and the souk and the water. I mean,
it just
the
didn't
architecture was
exist.
the boats.
Yeah.
No, it was, and it was something very special for Dubai Creek. And I think Sharjah Creek, though I never saw it. I only saw I saw it from inside the souk. I never had that view across because it was just a sandbar.
Sandbelt, yeah.
And it was a very strong architecture, and the density of wind towers in those 3 places, and with the souk area in Shindaga and in the Bastakir.
But one of the drawbacks of the Arish, of course, particularly out in the desert and also up in the mountains where they had Arish, was that it housed gentlemen who were not welcome. Once we were camped by some water in Wadi Al Ghor, and someone came past, a local. Actually, he was wearing running shoes and he was out for a run. And he said, "How can you camp here? Come and stay in my house." And he had, of course, a modern Beit Shabir. He said, "There are scorpions here and there are snakes here. It's dangerous."
Traditional building materials don't comply with any codes.
Right.
So if you want to build, a public building,
Of course.
I think, what
To
can we
start
do?
from
We
scratch.
have to start from scratch.
That was the problem they had in the old fort, which ultimately the entire old and new and everything was part of the Center for Documentation and Exhibition areas. And it was always a question of how could one have, microfilms in thousands of miles of microfilm and all of this in this old building. So eventually the place was rehoused, the center was rehoused.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, one also has to books were accumulated in the center, inside the old fort, which was, after all, the rulers, the center of rule and the center of government. And in that place, a library was established, and archive material was brought from other nations' archives at a time when there were no roads in Abu Dhabi. I mean, just imagine in '68, this venture was started just because one wanted to have the archive material to evidence what is what, also on borders and the local history in general. But to, for Sheikh Zayed and with, Ahmed Khalifa Suedi was the sort of supervised it all, and to have this idea, we now have something like that. Before one had even a Ministry of Justice or any of this. I think was in hindsight one can see what a sort of forward-looking idea.
Yes.
But I was thinking, you mentioned concrete, cement floors and so on. Of course, cement floors were a godsend to many people, because in a Arish you have a sand floor, or if you're over towards Alain, the mountains, or as we've seen in Oman, you have a mud floor. Well, something is spilt on it. What happens? I suppose in the sand you turn the sand over. On the mud, it soaks in, but a concrete floor, you can wipe it clean.
Yes.
Wonderful. It's
Hygienic.
much more hygienic, much more satisfactory.
Traditionally, in the Emirati house, there are three separation in the space: semi-public, semi-private, and the private. Always the majlis and the traditional house between the semi-public and semi-private. It is like between the outside and the inside. Although there is a great change on the facade of the houses, visual part of the houses, okay, externally, the space itself configuration is still there, mainly in terms of majlis. Always majlis become part of external and internal. It's never been in the middle of the house. And when I talk about majlis, I talk about the main reception hall. Okay, so always the main reception hall, majlis itself, situated on the part of outside, inside. Although the house is developed, although most of the houses now become like villa, but the majlis always situated in the corner between the outside and the
accessible
inside.
place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
But what has changed is that what was the courtyard, which was the breathing space of the house, and it was a climatic modifier, and it was a place where there would be some goats probably, and some trees, and chickens. It was very private. It was where the women were, and the children were brought up, safe from the eyes of strangers, and safe from the street. So and it's a very symbolic part of the house, and the majlis would be quite close to it.
Yes.
But as you say, on that fringe between the public and the private. And now what has happened is that the courtyard has come to the outside. It becomes a perimeter garden. The garden becomes something surrounding the house, and the villas are much more in the Western style of houses, as a block in a space away from the boundary. Yes. But the majlis still sits on the boundary, right. And that hasn't changed. That's the most enduring part. I think that's really interesting. Yes. The other change that I observed is that when I really studied the House of the Bastakir, and you see it in old quarters if you go to Nizwa and so on, the houses are absolutely plain on the outside traditionally, apart from the entrance. The entrance may have a very elaborate door. It may have a portico and some sort of porch, which is more elaborate. And you have the wind towers, which obviously became a symbol of celebrating life or wealth or success. But everything else on the house doesn't, on the outside. All of the decoration is in the courtyard, And there can be very beautiful decoration, but it's only visible to the family. That has changed because the modern villa, all the decoration is on the outside. And the wealthier the family, undoubtedly, they're more ostentatious and more life is celebrated. And there's a richness which we wouldn't have seen 50 years ago.
Yeah. And still the entrance, is still as it is in the traditional house, still has an important element.
Very important,
currently.
yes.
Always there is emphasis on the entrance of the house. People always reflect their status by the entrance, by making more decoration to the entrance of the house.
The door, people actually would take
Yes.
nothing else, but they take the door from one building to the next, to
yes.
the new house.
Yeah.